December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sits in his command bunker, reading the final operational orders for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. He's 69 years old, one of Hitler's most experienced and respected commanders, a professional soldier who has led armies since before most of his staff officers were born. And as he reads through the plan for Germany's last major offensive in the West, he does something that shocks everyone in the room. He laughs. Not a chuckle. Not a diplomatic acknowledgement. A bitter, exhausted laugh that comes from a man who has finally understood a truth so overwhelming that the only response left is dark humor. His chief of staff, General Siegfried Westphal, will later recall the moment in his memoirs. Von Rundstedt looked up from the papers, gestured at the meticulously planned offensive, and said something that would become legendary among German officers who survived the war. This will work for perhaps 2 weeks. Then the Americans will bring up their reserves, and we will have nothing left to counter them with. Nothing, because they have reserves we cannot even imagine. Westphal, confused, asked what he meant. Von Rundstedt's response was devastating in its simplicity. The Americans can afford to lose this battle. We cannot afford to win it. In that moment, Hitler's best general had admitted something that German high command had been denying for 3 years. American industrial production wasn't just superior, it was impossible. It defied every known principle of warfare, economics, and military logistics. It was so far beyond German capabilities that fighting against it was mathematically, strategically, and psychologically futile. This is the story of the moment Germany's finest military minds looked at the numbers and realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a factory that happened to have soldiers, and that factory was about to bury them in an avalanche of steel. To understand von Rundstedt's despair, you need to understand what German generals believed about war in 1939. They weren't stupid. They weren't blind nationalists. They were products of the finest military education system in the world, men who had studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, and Moltke. And their entire understanding of modern warfare was built on one core principle: quality over quantity. The German military doctrine, refined over centuries, emphasized superior training, tactical brilliance, and technological excellence. A well-trained German division, they believed, could defeat 2 or even 3 enemy divisions through superior leadership and battlefield innovation. This wasn't arrogance. It was the lesson of Frederick the Great, who had held off 3 major powers with a tiny army. It was the legacy of the Prussian General Staff, which had defeated France in 1870 through superior planning and execution. In 1940, this doctrine seemed vindicated. Germany invaded France with roughly equal numbers of tanks and fewer soldiers than the combined Allied forces, and yet they won in 6 weeks. How? Superior tactics. The Blitzkrieg doctrine concentrated armor at specific breakthrough points, bypassed strong positions, and paralyzed the enemy command structure through speed and psychological shock. The math seemed to support their philosophy. Why build 10,000 mediocre tanks when you could build 3,000 excellent ones? Why waste resources on mass production when you could create masterpieces of engineering? The Panzer IV, the Tiger, the Panther. These were weapons built by craftsmen, not assembly lines. Each tank was individually fitted, tested, and refined. And for the first 2 years of the war, it worked. In Poland, in France, in the early days of Operation Barbarossa, German armor and tactics were simply superior to anything the Allies could field. They won battles while being outnumbered because they were better. Soldier for soldier, tank for tank, they were the best in the world. But there was a problem with this philosophy. It assumed the enemy would play by the same rules. It assumed wars were won by excellence, not by mathematics. And then they encountered American production, which didn't just break the rules. It made the rules irrelevant. The first hints came in late 1942. German intelligence officers in Berlin began receiving reports from their agents in America that made no sense. The numbers were so absurd, they assumed the reports were Allied disinformation. American shipyards, they were told, were building Liberty ships, cargo vessels designed to supply Britain at a rate of 3 per day. 3 per day. The German response was essentially, check your sources, that's impossible. But the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was supposedly producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal was building Sherman tanks on an automotive assembly line, treating 30-ton armored vehicles like they were sedans. The numbers being reported were 40,000 aircraft per year, 50,000 tanks over the course of the war, production figures that exceeded Germany's entire industrial capacity. General Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, compiled a report in early 1943 that should have changed everything. He calculated that American industrial output was approximately 4 times that of Germany's. Not 50% more, not double, 4 times. And that was just America. Britain was producing another quarter of what Germany could manage. The Soviet Union, despite losing half its industrial base to German invasion, was somehow matching German tank production. The math was brutal. For every German tank destroyed, Germany could build 1 replacement, maybe 2 if they pushed their workers harder and scrapped other programs. For every American Sherman destroyed, America could build 4 replacements without even straining their economy. For every Luftwaffe fighter shot down, the replacement might take weeks to build and the pilot would be barely trained. For every American fighter lost, the replacement was already sitting at the port, ready to ship, and the new pilot had 300 hours of flight time. Thomas's report concluded with a sentence that was considered defeatist by the Nazi leadership. We are not fighting a war of production. We are being crushed by an industrial system we cannot compete with. He was quietly reassigned. The report was buried, because accepting its conclusions meant accepting that Germany had already lost. Von Rundstedt didn't have access to Thomas's full report in 1944, but he had something better: battlefield experience. He'd watched it happen in real time. And the specific moment when he understood the truth came not from statistics, but from observing a single American supply dump after the Allied breakout from Normandy. It was September 1944. German forces had been pushed back across France in a chaotic retreat. Von Rundstedt, brought out of retirement to stabilize the Western Front, was touring the former German positions. His officers took him to a captured American logistics base near St. Lo that had been overrun briefly during a counterattack before being abandoned again. What he saw there broke something in his understanding of war. The dump covered approximately 40 acres, row after row after row of supplies, stacked ammunition crates as far as you could see, mountains of ration boxes, fuel drums in quantities that would supply the entire Africa Corps for a month, spare parts for every conceivable piece of equipment, organized and labeled, medical supplies that exceeded what was available in some German field hospitals, clothing, boots, replacement weapons still in their factory wrappings. And this wasn't a major supply depot. This was a forward logistics point for a single American corps. 1 corps out of dozens. Von Rundstedt stood there with his staff, and someone asked him what he thought. His response, recorded by multiple witnesses, "We have already lost." Because what he was looking at wasn't just supplies. It was a philosophy of war that Germany couldn't match. The Americans didn't carefully ration their resources. They didn't meticulously calculate minimum requirements. They oversupplied everything, built in massive redundancy, and treated material as essentially unlimited. If a truck broke down, they didn't repair it in the field. They pushed it aside and grabbed another one from the endless convoy. German logistics officers calculated supplies down to the last kilogram. They rationed ammunition and fuel with painful precision. A German division received exactly what it needed, sometimes less. An American division received what it needed, plus 30% extra, plus reserve stocks, plus backup reserves for the reserves. It was the difference between a craftsman carefully measuring wood for a single perfect cabinet and a factory stamping out 1,000 adequate ones per day. Both approaches worked, but only one could sustain a multi-year global war. The breaking point for von Rundstedt's belief in German superiority came during the planning for the Ardennes offensive. Hitler had ordered a massive attack designed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. On paper, it was audacious, but possible. Germany scraped together 3 armies, over 200,000 men, and achieved complete surprise on December 16, 1944. For the first 72 hours, it worked. American lines buckled, units were cut off. The Germans advanced 50 miles in some sectors. It looked like a replay of 1940, when German armor had stunned the world with its speed and aggression. Hitler was ecstatic. His generals had told him it couldn't be done, and he was proving them wrong. Von Rundstedt watched the early success with the grim certainty of a man watching a chess game where he could see the inevitable checkmate 10 moves ahead. Because he knew what was coming, he'd seen it before. The Americans would bring up reserves. They always brought up reserves. What happened next is burned into military history. General Eisenhower, commanding from Paris, looked at the breakthrough and made a decision that demonstrated the fundamental difference between American and German warfare. He didn't panic. He didn't try to plug the hole with whatever units were closest. He did math. Within 24 hours, entire divisions that had been fighting in other sectors were disengaged, loaded onto trucks, and sent to the Ardennes. The 101st Airborne, resting in reserve, was in Bastogne within 48 hours. Patton's Third Army, 90 miles to the south and preparing for a completely different offensive, was ordered to turn 90 degrees and attack north into the German flank. Patton's staff said it would take a week to reorient. Patton said they'd do it in 48 hours. They did it in 48 hours. An entire army, over 100,000 men with all their equipment, supplies, and support elements, executed a 90-degree turn and attacked in a new direction, with a speed that German planners had calculated was logistically impossible. How? Because American logistics weren't based on careful calculation. They were based on overwhelming abundance. Every division had more trucks than they strictly needed. Every corps had fuel reserves that German officers would have considered wasteful. Every army had supply dumps positioned in multiple locations, allowing rapid redistribution. The Germans had committed every reserve they had to the initial assault. When those forces stalled at Bastogne and along the northern shoulder, there was nothing left. No second wave. No strategic reserve. No reinforcements. When an entire panzer division bogged down outside Bastogne, von Rundstedt received requests for replacements, for fuel, for ammunition. His response, recorded in multiple accounts: "With what? We have nothing left." Meanwhile, The Americans were flooding the battlefield with fresh divisions. Not green, untrained troops scrounged from training depots, fully equipped, well-supplied combat divisions that had been in reserve or fighting in other sectors. The First Army received 4 divisions within a week, then 6 more, then elements of 8 more after that. Each division arrived with full ammunition loads, full fuel, and hot meals for the troops. The contrast was so stark that German soldiers who were captured began asking their interrogators a question that revealed the psychological impact. Where do you get all this? One captured German major, when shown to a POW camp that had been set up in less than 72 hours, complete with heated barracks, medical facilities, and 3 hot meals a day, asked his American captor, "How is this possible? We were told your country was on the verge of economic collapse from war costs." The American officer laughed and explained that this camp, along with everything in it, had been built by a single engineering battalion in 2 days. The major didn't believe him. It wasn't that he thought the officer was lying. He literally couldn't process the concept. German combat engineers were elite units that built fortifications under fire. American combat engineers built POW camps with hot showers as an afterthought. Von Rundstedt's prediction was exact. The offensive worked for 2 weeks. Then the Americans brought up reserves that Germany couldn't match. The German offensive ground to a halt not because of superior Allied tactics or brilliant counterattacks, but because they simply ran out of fuel, ammunition, and men. The armies that had advanced 50 miles in the opening days were now immobile, surrounded, and being systematically destroyed. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had committed its last mobile reserves, lost over 100,000 men, expended equipment and fuel it couldn't replace, and achieved nothing strategic. The Americans had suffered heavy casualties, but within weeks, those losses were made good with replacement troops and new equipment flowing from the United States. The final crushing realization for German commanders came when they compiled the loss statistics. In the Ardennes, Germany lost approximately 800 tanks and assault guns, irreplaceable losses. The factories in Germany were running at barely 50% capacity due to Allied bombing. Skilled workers were being drafted into infantry units. Raw materials were scarce. Those 800 tanks represented months of production that Germany didn't have. American losses were approximately 730 tanks. Within 6 weeks, all of them had been replaced. The replacement Shermans were already in depots in Britain before the battle even ended. American factories had produced more tanks in the time it took to fight the Battle of the Bulge than Germany had lost in the entire engagement. This is when von Rundstedt made his most famous statement, the one that encapsulated the entire German strategic nightmare. In a staff meeting in late January 1945, discussing defensive plans for the Rhine, one of his younger officers suggested that if they could inflict enough casualties on the Americans, public opinion might force a negotiated peace. Von Rundstedt's response was recorded by multiple people present. "The Americans have a production system we cannot understand and cannot match. They can build a bomber faster than we can shoot it down. They can replace a division faster than we can destroy it. And they can do this while also feeding Britain, supplying Russia, and fighting Japan on the other side of the world. This is not a war of soldiers. This is a war of factories, and we lost that war in 1942. The numbers bear this out with brutal clarity. In 1944, at the peak of German war production under Albert Speer's rationalization programs, Germany produced approximately 19,000 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 96,000. Germany built 27,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. America built 29,000 tanks just for themselves, plus 8,000 more for Britain and Russia. But it's not just the totals, It's the nature of the production. A German Tiger tank took approximately 300,000 man-hours to build. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering with a 80 mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. But it broke down frequently, required specially trained crews, used parts that weren't standardized, and cost the same resources as 4 Panzer IVs. An American Sherman took 10,000 man-hours to build. It was inferior to the Tiger in almost every combat metric, but it was reliable, easy to repair, used standardized parts, could be operated by crews with moderate training, and could be produced at a rate of 1 per hour at peak production. Germany chose excellence. America chose abundance. And in total war, abundance wins. Because you can't win a war of attrition with boutique weapons. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. They'd been raised in a military culture that valued tactical genius, operational art, and battlefield excellence. They'd won against France with inferior numbers through superior tactics. They'd executed encirclements in Russia that were studied as masterpieces of maneuver warfare. And none of it mattered, because the Americans didn't need tactical genius. They needed logistics. They didn't need brilliant breakthroughs. They needed reliable supply chains. They didn't need wonder weapons. They needed enough adequate weapons to overwhelm any defense through sheer volume. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, wrote in his post-war memoirs about a conversation he had with an American interrogator in 1945. The American asked him if he understood why Germany lost. Guderian's response revealed the depth of the cultural disconnect. "We lost because you did not fight the way we expected you to fight. We prepared for a war of quality. You delivered a war of quantity. We built beautiful machines. You built assembly lines. We created armies of professionals. You created a system that could turn civilians into soldiers faster than we could kill them. We were playing chess. You were playing a completely different game we didn't even know existed." The American interrogator noted that Guderian seemed almost personally offended by this, as if mass production was somehow unsporting. And perhaps that's the real story here. Von Rundstedt didn't just realize American production was impossible in the sense of being beyond German capability. He realized it was impossible in a deeper, more philosophical sense. It was impossible for the German military mind to even conceive of war being fought this way. Warfare, to a German officer in 1944, was an art. It required skill, experience, and excellence. The Americans had turned it into manufacturing. They'd industrialized violence on a scale that made traditional military virtues almost obsolete. A perfectly executed encirclement meant nothing when the encircled units were resupplied by air within 24 hours. Destroying an enemy division meant nothing when 2 more arrived within a week. The Widowmaker wasn't a specific weapon. It was the entire American economic system, weaponized and directed at total victory. Every factory, every farm, every mine, every worker, all coordinated into a single massive production apparatus that could simultaneously fight wars on 3 continents while maintaining the highest standard of living for civilians of any nation involved in the conflict. German workers in 1944 were on starvation rations, working 12-hour shifts in bombed-out factories. American workers in 1944 were earning overtime, buying war bonds with their disposable income, and still had access to consumer goods that had disappeared from Europe years earlier. This wasn't just economic superiority. It was a different category of national power entirely. When von Rundstedt admitted that American production was impossible, he wasn't surrendering because Germany had lost a battle. He was acknowledging that they'd been fighting a war they never had any chance of winning. Once America fully mobilized, once the factories ramped up, once the logistics networks were established, the outcome was mathematically determined. Everything else was just Germany bleeding itself dry against an opponent that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The war in Europe ended 4 months after the Battle of the Bulge failed. Germany had fought with courage, skill, and determination. Their soldiers and commanders demonstrated tactical brilliance right up to the end. And it meant nothing, because they weren't fighting tactics. They weren't fighting armies. They were fighting American GDP. And you can't outfight an economy that produces more steel in a month than you produce in a year. Von Rundstedt surrendered to American forces in May 1945. In his final interrogation before being transferred to a POW camp, he was asked what he would have done differently if he could fight the war again. His answer was short: convinced Hitler not to start it. Because once the Americans joined, once their factories started running, once their logistics system deployed, the war wasn't about military strategy anymore. It was about mathematics, and the math had been hopeless from the beginning. Germany just didn't realize it until their best general looked at the numbers and understood that fighting American production wasn't just difficult. It was impossible.